Inside the stories that affect you. This is Inside KELOLAND.
Welcome to Inside KELOLAND. This past spring, nearly 1,000 unmarked graves of Indigenous children were discovered on the grounds of former Canadian boarding schools. Following international attention, the U.S. Secretary of the Interior announced an investigation into the history of U.S. boarding schools with a mission to find potentially unmarked graves throughout the country and identify the children in them. Some of those graves are in South Dakota. The state had 25 Indian boarding schools and was also home to the nation's only insane asylum for Native Americans. Today, we reveal the threat behind the boarding schools and the unmarked graves discovered at the old Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum site. Most golfers hitting the links at the Hiawatha Golf Course in Canton probably don't realize what lies between the 4th and 5th fairways. A small cemetery, a reminder of South Dakota's dark past, is marked off by a wooden fence tied with ribbons and feathers.
As we enter from the west side, we come across the monument that has 120 names of those that we know are interned here.
At least 120 Native Americans lived in deplorable conditions until they died at the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum. In all, 400 Native American inmates were housed here over 3 decades.
The threat around the country, and we've been told by elders that they heard this in boarding school, that if they were bad, they would be sent to Canton, and everyone knew it was a death sentence. If you were sent there, you didn't really come out.
All that remains today of the asylum building is part of the front entrance, which has been incorporated into a sign for the golf course. A few original barns are also still standing. However, several keepers of the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum story are making sure what took place here is not forgotten.
People vanished out of boarding schools. People went to jail and didn't come back. So people didn't know where their relatives were. So it's still a shock. It's like finding out that you had somebody in your family who was in a concentration camp.
The concentration camp analogy is not far-fetched.
And there actually is some evidence that Hitler studied what we did with the reservations, the boarding schools in Canton, to figure out how to create the concentrations that he created in Germany for the Nazis. So it's a worldwide story, not just a local story.
A horrific story of shocking conditions.
It's not an insane asylum. It's a prison. People are shackled to beds with chamber pots, even though it was state-of-the-art with toilets and running water and all of this. The place was caked in soot. People are lying in their feces, maggots crawling on them.
Disease ran rampant and untreated. While Richard Pettigrew is often hailed as the founding father of Sioux Falls and South Dakota's first senator, he had a hand in Hiawatha.
So Senator Pettigrew saw this as his solution to the Indian problem, and he also saw it as a moneymaker.
A moneymaker it was. Thousands of tourists flocked to the asylum, buying up souvenir plates and spoons. Did the tourists see how people were treated?
They only were allowed in at certain times, certain days.
Complaints about what was going on in Hiawatha led to more than 24 investigations by federal authorities. But it was never enough to shut it down.
And there's reports that say these poor people are stuck in this terrible place, but they're going to have to stay here till they die.
Wow, that really happened in America?
Here,
South Dakota.
It happened right here.
Right. 53 tribes are represented in this cemetery from all over the nation.
Only 2 grave markers have surfaced. And while the burial map lists 121 names, ground sensing technology indicates there may be even more bodies.
They found in the first row on this side 7 other anomalies that do not have names on the plot map. So we don't know.
There are suspicions there are bodies elsewhere. We know that some bodies were shipped back to reservations, but we're not really sure how often that really happened.
It's always been a battle or a massacre, or, I call this the slowest massacre on record, because they just slowly did away for 30 years with our Mitako Oyase.
Jerry Fogg is an artist and member of the Yankton Sioux tribe.
When we do talk of our people and stuff, we say Mitako Oyase, which is we are all related. And even though we don't know these people and we have never met their relatives or anything else, in spirit, we are all related in who we are.
Fogg uses his art to keep the story of Hiawatha alive.
I talk about my artwork, and then I come across a piece that I've done on Hiawatha, and I mention, this is the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum, and everybody starts looking at each other. What? And I said, yes, this is, outside of Canton. And then, they find it hard to believe.
The horrors that took place here aren't well documented, and even those records were sealed for 70 years, not being made public until the early 2000s. Only a few artifacts remain, like these dolls made by an inmate. After Hiawatha was finally shut down in 1933, the building changed hands a few times before being dismantled. The cemetery is the only physical reminder of the suffering Native Americans endured.
It's quite a humbling and kind of emotional experience when you come in and you feel the spirit that's here. It's a dark place in our history, but it's something that has to be brought out.
Nobody is here to take care of these 53 different tribes, 124 plus Native Americans. Nobody's there to speak up for them. They lay out there in the cold and the heat without any representation. And I am very happy for the keepers to come forward and include me in this process of informing the public. Now we just got to get a bigger voice.
Now, you may be wondering why the asylum's land was turned into a golf course. That happened in the 1940s, and because it was federal land, it could only be earmarked for public use. There are rules to keep golfers from playing in the cemetery. Well, there is a lot more to this story. When we come back, we continue our conversation with the keepers of the Hiawatha story. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. Over the past several years, there has been a renewed effort to uncover the truth of how Native Americans were treated in the late 1800s through the early 1900s, particularly at boarding schools. But as we just learned, there was also the nation's only asylum in Canton, South Dakota. And joining us today to talk about the conditions at this facility are Jerry Fogg, Ann Dylan Schneider, and Ross Lothrop. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And you all have picked up this story. You're called the keepers of the Hiawatha story because it's so important that people learn about it, yet very few people seem to know much about it. Why is that? Why don't more people know that this happened?
I think if you go back in history, a lot of the dark elements are kept dark. And even the people that live in Canton, there are people that don't know about it. I think we can attribute a lot of this story coming out going back to 1988 when Harold Ironshield started the honoring and remembrance ceremonies.
And is it in our history books in school?
No, not that we're aware of.
No. So maybe something you'd all like to add to the curriculum.
Right. Yep, and with the social studies curriculum being reviewed here in the state of South Dakota, there's an opportunity now for us to have maybe some input. Public hearings are going on, public opinion is going to be taking place, so hopefully some doors will open. Could
we talk about a little bit, go back in the history of this, because I only had so much time in the story that I did, and I know there's just so we could talk for hours. It could be obviously a full documentary. There are several books written on the subject if you're interested in that. But when it started, Richard Pettigrew felt that this was a solution. And then from there, South Dakota received the only insane asylum. Why was there only one in South Dakota?
Well, first of all, Native Americans were wards of the federal government, so they could not be put in a state institution or a local institution. So there had to be a federal institution. And then there was some going on in Congress about who would get it, and Pettigrew, Gifford, and some others advocated very strongly for it and said this would be a solution to the Indian problem. There was a lot of opposition from reservation agents who were afraid it would be used to just warehouse people, or someone that a reservation agent didn't like or a boarding school didn't like would be sent there and warehoused, and that's exactly what happened.
I think how it ended up in Canton. We're a central location of the United States.
Right, and on a railroad.
And what kind of definition did they have for insane? Were any of these people, anybody suffering from mental illness in this facility?
When it was closed, when Samuel Silk, who's a psychiatrist, came out from the National Mental Health Hospital, which is St. Elizabeth's in Washington, found that very few people had any mental illness at all. Most of the people were suffering from epilepsy, dementia, reactions to medications. Some of the medications were horrible. Native Americans didn't have a word for insane in any group.
Were they put on barbiturates or?
I don't know. I'd have to look.
I don't know if we ever really reviewed
I don't know
or
if you
seen
know
the records of what medication
what they were
used.
on. Right, but basically, the Native communities didn't have a word for insane because everybody was valued at whatever level they were functioning at. So that wasn't a concept. However, the paperwork to get in was just like one line. This person's insane, I'm sending them to Canton. That was the only intake paperwork. And it often was just because they'd angered somebody.
So often a punishment.
Right.
And when we talk about the threat behind the boarding schools, how did that play out?
There were a fair number of youngsters that were there. I believe one of the youngest persons admitted was like 7 or 8 years old.
Right.
And yet we have elders and medicine men that were admitted, and they were in their late 70s, or I know there's one person that was 83 when he passed away.
And the boarding schools actually had power even over adults, because that's how Cleto Tafoya ended up there, was the Santa Fe boarding school sent him. He was an adult with 7 children. But because he had taken off on a trading post with the FTC and had enemies, he was deemed insane and sent to Canton. But the boarding school's the one that sent him, even though he wasn't a student.
So it's often retaliation for something.
Quite possible.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what about, there was a woman housed there who had too many children?
Mm-hmm.
That is true. There was one that had children repetitively for a number of years, which is fine and not uncommon, but that was...
Especially in those days.
Right.
It was a sign that she had no restraint. That was in her paperwork.
And we talked a little bit about the conditions there, how people were shackled to their beds. Mm-hmm. Why? Was there any reasons given?
I don't know that there's really any record explaining it, is there?
Well, there wasn't enough staff. Congress kept providing money for staffing, and Harry Hummer, who was the superintendent, kept refusing the money and didn't increase staffing. So if you have to keep track of people, one thing you can do is chain them up.
And did they receive medical care?
No.
Because Hummer was a psychiatrist.
He was a psychiatrist. He claimed that he had no time to do any medical care. The only 2 physicians were there, the first one till 1908, and then the second one for 6 months in 1908. After that, there's no medical care at all until some nurses arrive in the late 20s, but then they're each fired because they started complaining.
Yeah, so the federal investigations that happen sometimes because of these nurses.
Well, and regular staff, too, complained.
Yeah, very much so. It was the people that were working there were bringing forth their concerns and what was being done, what should have been done, and what wasn't done.
And it took a lot of courage because they were fired. If they complained, they were immediately fired. And we know from Manfred Hill that many of these were very upstanding members of the Canton community who were highly regarded and were fired. So, a lot of this is happening during the beginnings of the Dust Bowl and the Depression. People are speaking up and losing their jobs on behalf of Native Americans, which is a very courageous part of the story.
That is a wonderful part of the story, actually, if there's anything good in this story.
Yeah.
Well, we are going to continue to talk about that. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. Inside KELOLAND. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. Children from the Rosebud Sioux tribe were some of those taken to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania 100 years ago. Earlier this month, the remains of 9 of those children were returned to South Dakota. A caravan accompanied by sirens and the roar of motorcycles escorted them to a location behind the Fort Randall Casino and Hotel as part of the last leg of their very long journey home.
It's sad that it took this long, but it's also a relief that they are home now.
Members of the Rosebud Sioux tribe say this is not the end of the journey because they still have more relatives buried at boarding schools who need to come home. Now that's the boarding schools. We're talking about the Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum, which was the name of the facility, and the bodies that are buried there. There were 121 on the roster, right? The list on the burial plot. But tell me a little bit about the fact that there must be more bodies than that.
2016, Lavana Judah with the Yankton Sioux tribe was able to have the Choctaw Nation out of Oklahoma come up with a ground sonar sensor. And they spent several days going over the lands, and they're denoted the different tiers. And comparing the plot map to the marks on their sonar printout, there's at least 7 different graves that do not have names attached to them.
What does that indicate to you? What does that mean? Could there be more bodies throughout the land as well?
They did. They went beyond the cemetery itself with the sonar sensor and examined. They did not find any remains outside of, and I believe they went up to about 100 yards outside of that. But it is disturbing. But we also know, as Ann said earlier, the records are so incomplete. And when they shut it down in February of 1934 officially, they had incomplete records. They couldn't find records that were being asked for in Washington, D.C. So, you know, it's an unknown of where those records are.
So the monument has been made with the 120 names, and there are a couple of gravestones out there, but only 2. Why is that?
When they closed the cemetery, or excuse me, the asylum in 34, it was noted in the closing letter that there were stone markers for each one of the graves. And the individual writing it did say there's no guarantee how long they will last there, if they will be pirated, so to speak, or if they will be sunk down into the ground. So we're not really sure if there are any more, and it's quite possible the 2 stones that are there were brought in by relatives at some point, because the stones back then cost 25 to 30 cents a piece.
Now we see the bodies being brought back from boarding schools to return to various tribal nations. Jerry, there are 53 different tribes represented. How is that going to be navigated, do you think, with Hiawatha?
Well, at one time when we first got together as the keepers, we tried to notify every reservation by writing them a letter and letting them know that they have relatives here. And by some point of being tossed or neglected, or our person looking saying, Hiawatha, what is that? And throwing the letter away without even looking at it. I still think that a lot of these tribal entities do not know that they have relatives there. And there is the part to where, as a Native American myself, we hold respect for our elders. And what is going on with the children today is a precious thing. What's going on with the elders at Canton is a respectful thing. And together we both have to deal with that emotion and that feeling, and it has to be dealt with.
Some bodies have been exhumed, correct?
Yes, the most recent body repatriated was in 1982, and that was handled by the funeral home in Canton, and that lady's remains were sent back to her tribal nation in Oklahoma.
So how do all the different religions, beliefs of each of the tribes affect the ability to really do anything different with the bodies that are buried there than what's already happened? It
is a big problem among the nations in America, because some of them do not speak the names no more. Some of them believe that the body there is just the shell. The spirit is gone, the soul is gone, in so many different religions. And I guess the only way we can really deal with it is to, again, contact these people and find out if they want to be represented in any way or form.
And most of them died horrible deaths, right? They were untreated. Was anybody killed or murdered that you know of, or any records indicating that? Tortured to death or anything like that? I don't know if we've ever come across
anything like that.
Mostly,
in my mind, they all were.
Well,
yeah. Long term.
Yeah. Long-term,
long. As you talked about, a slow massacre.
Right. A slow massacre.
Right. Most of the deaths were tuberculosis, syphilis, things that they knew how to treat,
but did not.
But did not treat. Ran rampant, basically.
Okay, well, we are going to return to continue this conversation. Stay with us. Inside KELOLAND, we'll be right back. Well, you are looking at some of the few remaining artifacts from Hiawatha because the building is long gone, and several books that have been written about it that are out there if you're interested in getting some more information. And artist Jerry Fogg has also created art pieces telling the story. Jerry, can we talk about, well, this piece, first of all, Ascension, that's right by me. It's beautiful and haunting. Tell me what it means and your inspiration behind it.
Well, in making that picture, the ghostly figures that are ascending out from behind the buildings of Hiawatha is not that they are leaving, but to show that, presenting that they are still there. They are still there waiting to be taken away, taken home, or at least even recognized with respect of who they are, because they were human as much as anybody else.
That's why we're talking about this today. I mean, this painting represents exactly what we're talking about.
Thank you. Yeah, it was done by the Blood Run. At that time, I was one of the members of the Blood Run Artists of the Big Sioux, and we were a couple that really, as an art group, joined into the Hiawatha situation and tried to establish ourselves as artists.
And there is a piece behind me, too, over my shoulder. What is the name of this piece?
This is the major piece that I call Hiawatha Indian Insane Asylum. It was done in the factor that the names had to be shown of those who are there so people could see it, and I had to put it in an art piece so people would look at the art and realize who was there in the naming. Now, in the bone beads that go down there, this is all original materials. They are separated in a distance because to represent that nobody was there to protect these Native Americans. And that was their protection long ago, because when they were closely together, rocks and arrows and stones would just bounce off of it. But here they weren't protected, so that's why the distance is there. And as if you look closely, there's an American flag upside down. And that's in the representation that we all know is a disaster, is, you know, in peril.
This is an America's shame, really.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's been swept.
Now, you're all keepers of the Hiawatha story, in part because of the South Dakota Humanities Council, correct?
Right.
And you can, because of that, can bring the story out into the community, into the state. Tell us a little bit about that. If you want to hear this story, you want it brought to your group or school, what can people do?
So they can contact. Jerry and I have been working, Larry and Ross is coming on board. We partnered with the Humanities Council 4 or 5 years ago, I think, and they are gracious enough to provide, you know, travel expenses for us, housing expenses, so we can go to the smallest community in South Dakota. I think there's an administrative fee of like $50 that helps the council run, but it's part of their mission to get South Dakota stories everywhere. So if there's 5 people, we'll show up. They just have to contact the Humanities Council. So.
Okay, we will let people know how to do that, too.
Yeah.
And we've done, through Jerry and Ann and our Keepers group, which officially was entitled in 2014, we've done over 48 presentations or exhibits, including helping Lavana and others with the honorings since we've come into being.
And you do a honoring ceremony typically every year, but the pandemic put that on hold. When is your next one? Out at the site?
Out at the site. We're looking at September 18th this year, and again, due to the COVID, a smaller gathering. There's some transformations going on out there as far as properties and where we can hold some things. But we do an annual honoring, and we will publicize that. And it's most commonly a potluck, and we involve the Sacred Horse Society when we can from Rosebud, and tribal officials from wherever we can get them to respect and honor and remember as well as educate.
So important to tell the story. Thank you for doing that.
The title.
And that is all the time we have for today. Sorry about that. If you'd like to learn more about today's topic, just go to this story on KELOLAND.com. Be sure to join us again next week for more on what's going on inside KELOLAND.